Hello and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Bernard Cornwell, author of the Sharpe series and many other novels. Bernard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for asking me, Colin.
What I'd really like to start with is some of the history that you write about. In the Sharpe series, you are writing about the Peninsular War, something that I was not very familiar with before diving into your novels. So tell me about this history and what interested you in writing about it.
Well, I think I got interested years and years ago when I was a teenager and I read all those wonderful Hornblower novels. And after I graduated and was working for the BBC, I realized that there were two or three other authors, all making a very good living, it seemed, off the Napoleonic Wars. There was Alexander Pope, Douglas Reman, all writing novels that were, in a sense, similar to the Hornblower books. And much as I liked all those books, I wondered why nobody was writing a series about the adventures of the army under Wellington. And they were a series of extraordinary adventures and enormous success. And I thought, I want to read that series. And I would haunt the bookshops looking for it, and it never appeared. And then one day a little light went off in my mind and said, why don't you write it? So that's how I started. It's an attempt to, if you like, put Hornblower on land.
And can you talk a little bit more about the reasoning behind writing a novel? I know you had moved to the US and you needed to find work somehow, but did you always know that you had that in you to write a novel, to tell a story like this?
I didn't know I had it in me, but I had a desire to do it. I mean, much as I enjoyed my career in television, there was always at the back of my mind the thought that I would actually love to be a novelist. And you're quite right. When I moved to the States, I couldn't find a job. I wasn't allowed to get a green card. So I said to Judy, my wife, don't worry, darling, I'll write a book. So that's what I did. And that was the first of the Sharpe books. So it was sort of imposed on me. As I wasn't allowed to do a proper job in America, I thought I'll do an improper one and write a novel. Still doing it, still married to her.
And what was the process like for you? Was it a bit daunting and overwhelming at first? What did you kind of have to learn in order to make it work?
It was very daunting indeed. I mean, I'd never done it before. And I can remember sitting down and trying to start this wretched thing. What I learned was you just sit down every day and do it. And inevitably, halfway through the process, you'll realize you've messed it up totally and need to go back to the beginning and redo it. And that really hasn't changed very much. But now I actually don't know how many books I've written. It's close to 60, it may be more than 60, I really don't know. But still to this day, when I sit down and it's page one of a new one, I think, oh, this is impossible, I'll never do it. But somehow it gets done.
One thing I'm curious about is how the publishing industry has changed over the years. And I believe you published your first novel in 1981 or around that time. We're now 2024. Have things changed for you in any way? And what do you think about a young writer sitting down today trying to do the same thing that you did all those years ago? Are they facing different circumstances?
I guess they are, but I'm probably the wrong person to ask because luckily for me, I got established with a publisher and I've never left that publisher. What I think for new writers is that somehow, I don't think this has changed very much. The publishers are always looking for good material. And if you can provide them with good material, then trust me, they'll chase you and they want you. The difficulty is not in the actual writing. I mean, writing is actually quite easy. Writing well is a bit more difficult. It's knowing what to write about that's difficult. But And I think initially you write for yourself and you hope that what you write will also attract the attention of an agent or a publisher, and then take it to a wider audience. But essentially, I think publishers then and now are just desperately always looking out for good material. And if you can provide that material, then hey ho, it's off to the races.
And what about yourself as a writer? I read somewhere that you would be frightened to go back and read Sharpe's Eagle. How have you developed as a writer over time?
No idea. You better ask my editor that. I don't know. I mean, plainly, having written close to 60 books, if not more, I don't find it as difficult as I did at the very beginning. But that doesn't mean to say it's still easy. I mean, I think 95% of my job is finding the story. Um, I have an enormous envy of writers, and I know one or two who can plot a whole book out before they sit down and write it. I can't do that. I mean, I just bash into chapter one and see what happens. And I mean, I'm about halfway through a new book at the moment, and I really don't have a clue where it's going. And there always comes an awkward moment about two-thirds or three-quarters of the way through the process where a light goes off in your brain and it says, oh, that's what this novel is about. And then you go back and rewrite the whole damn thing to make it work. That still happens to me. I mean, I still don't know where a book is going. But I also think that one of the joys of reading a book is to find out what happens. For me, part of the joy of writing a book is to find out what happens. And I can remember James Hall, a very fine writer, saying to me once, how can you know? You're telling a story that's never been told before. You don't know the ending. No one else does. So you discover the ending for yourself.
Essentially, you're the first reader in that way. Can you talk about history though? Because do you ever hit a block where maybe history gets in the way of that story that you're discovering, or you have to find a way to insert the actual history into the lives of your characters? Does that become challenging in any way?
Always. To which I respond that I'm not an historian, I'm a storyteller. And when history and the story clash, history must suffer, and you change the history. Um, the history has to be authentic, but that doesn't mean to say it has to be exact. You can change things in history to suit your story, but then you have to admit your sins to the reader, which I always do in a historical note at the end and say, look, this didn't actually happen, but it was much more fun if it did. So although I stick very closely to the history, I'm not afraid to change it when it needs changing. I mean, I can't make Napoleon win the Battle of Waterloo, although the French seem to think he did actually. But I can change small events inside that battle, and do, and did.
And how would you describe your genre? I read that it's a historical thriller. So can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, as far as what readers can expect from your novels?
Well, I think probably what I'm known for is what you call military history fiction. Um, and I confess that I am very interested in war, and war provides a ready-made, exciting background for a book. So I tend to write about men and sometimes women who are caught up in war and how it affects them and how they affect it. So I just leave it at military history fiction, and that's it.
And this might be a question for a historian more than a storyteller, but what do you think can be gleaned from the stories that you tell from a historical perspective for readers today and what we see going on in the world today?
Well, I think readers will take whatever they want from it. Um, I mean, I'm sometimes asked if I have sort of a deliberate parallel in mind with things going on at the present, and the answer is no, I don't. I'm writing a story about things that happened hundreds of years ago. But as history has a wonderful habit of repeating itself, there's bound to be some parallels. I mean, if I have an ambition above just entertaining people, it would be to be a gateway to history, as the Hornblower stories were for me. when I ran out of Hornblower books, I think there were only 11, um, I went and read the real histories of the Napoleonic Wars and became rather addicted to these histories. And that's another purpose of the historical note at the end of the book, to tell you, look, if you like this, then there are other books you can read which will tell you a lot more and tell you the real story. So I hope it is a gateway to history, but not a lesson about history.
And for any listeners or viewers who haven't read any of your novels, where would you recommend they start? Any particular series, any particular novel? Can they just pick up any one of them?
Well, you can pick up any one of them because even though they're a series, each book is essentially a standalone book. I mean, there will be some references in that book to other adventures, but you don't need to have read them to read the book. Normally, when people ask me where do I begin, I'll either suggest Sharpe's Tiger, which is the very first chronological adventure of Richard Sharpe, or The Winter King. That's usually the one I recommend to women because it's more romantic than, there's not much romance in Sharpe. But The Winter King is essentially a romance as well as a story of history, although it's about history we know nothing whatever about, which is nice because if you're writing a historical novel about an unknown period, you can make it all up, which is fun.
From what I can tell, readers tend to get very caught up with their characters, feeling like maybe they know them personally. As I did research for the interview, people were often asking you about the Starbuck Chronicles, and they want to know more about what happens to that character. But I'm curious to know, what is it like for you to stay with a character or to leave a character for a while or to kill off a character?
Um, well, I get very fond of my characters. I mean, I've lived with Sharpe now for what? It's over 40 years, and I know him pretty well, and I enjoy his company, which is why it's always a joy to write a Sharpe book. I also became very fond of Uhtred, the Saxon warrior. But there comes a time when you realize that you've probably you've done all you can about that character. You just have to let them go. Um, as for killing them off, well, I'm not like the wonderful George in Game of Thrones, who slaughters his favorite characters with glee abandon, as far as I can see. But I mean, that's fun too. Sometimes you feel very sad when you kill a character off. I've actually cried over the computer at killing somebody off. But on the whole, I mean, I'm often asked what happens to Sharpe after the wars are over. And I just say he lives happily ever after. Leave it at that. But yes, you do get fond of them. And I mean, I find, like this morning, I took the dog for a walk, and you're having conversations with the character in your head, and they'll spring up out of nowhere. But oddly enough, a lot of those conversations find their way into the book one way or another. You become obsessed with them while you're writing the book, and then the moment it's finished, it's bye bye.
I'm also curious, your books have been turned into very successful TV series, such as The Last Kingdom. That's something that a lot of authors kind of aspire to when they first sit down to write a novel. They want to see it on the screen. What has that experience been like for you?
Well, it's been very gratifying. Most of the experience has been the same experience as everybody else. I mean, Judy and I sit down and watch them. I have nothing whatever to do with them. They're the two most successful series were The Last Kingdom and the Sharpe series, and both times the producers very nicely asked me if I wanted to be an advisor on the series, and I said no. The reason for that is that I did work in television for, oh Lord knows, at least 10 or 15 years, and know a great deal about television production, but absolutely nothing about producing drama. And I reckon that any advice I gave them would be an obstacle in their way, and only a fool puts an obstacle in their way. So for me, it was a huge pleasure just to sit down once a week and watch the new episode. With The Last Kingdom, Judy, my wife, would often turn to me in the middle of an episode and say, "Why did he do that?" And I'd say, "I don't know. I only wrote the books," and leave it at that. And because they change things, and they have to change things. They have constraints I don't have. I mean, if a Sharpe book I feel, is getting just a bit dull, I can wheel on 40,000 Frenchmen and let him set about them, but they can't do that because 40,000 Frenchmen costs a lot of money in extras. So they put other things in, and I think they did it very skillfully. So I enjoyed the series, all of them, very, very much. But as I said, I watched them as an outsider.
I think that's probably a healthy perspective. I can imagine if you got too tied up in the details, it might kind of be stressful. Well, we're speaking here in June, and I know in September you'll be at the Historical Novel Society UK conference. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it, but I know a lot of authors that are excited to see you there. Have you been to that conference before, and what are you looking forward to there?
Well, among other things, it's taking place in Totnes in Devon, and I used to live there, so it'd be very nice to go back. There's a couple of pubs there I remember very fondly, so I shall find time to visit those. Um, I think I went to one of these years ago. I actually enjoy them because you meet a lot of readers, and readers often give you good ideas. I can remember, I think it was at that conference that two or three people said to me that it was time Sharpe had an affair with an aristocratic lady. And it never occurred to me. So, but the next book I wrote, he has an affair with a very aristocratic lady, and it rather changes his life, as it would, I think. So, I owe that totally to the readers who I met at one of those conferences. And it's also enormous fun to meet other people who are struggling with the same thing that you're struggling with. I mean, how to write a successful novel.
Can you tell us, you said you're in the middle of a novel, a manuscript right now. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Well, it's another Sharpe. I actually thought I'd finish with Sharpe altogether, but every 2 or 3 years I feel an urge to go back to him. And this one takes place right towards the end of the Peninsular War when the British have invaded southern France. And there's a series of battles which are really very much unknown. I mean, people have heard about the major battles of the Peninsular War. They know about Salamanca and maybe Talavera. Um, but the battles of the Nive, Saint Pierre, and the Nivelle, and the investment of Bayonne are really sort of unknown territory. So I'm taking poor Sharpe through that, and he's having a good time. So am I.
Good. Well, we'll definitely look forward to that. Well, Mr.
Well,
Cornwell, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
it's been a pleasure talking to you, Colin. We must do it again sometime.
Definitely.